Gosh, Marty, I thought that looked like a human brain. What
Much larger than my human brain.
Okay. Well, our speaker today almost needs no introduction. Dr. Ware is known to all of us. In fact, probably was involved in training most of us, and probably out at the Botanical Garden has worked with most of us too. But she is a true star. She was raised in Southwest Missouri. She attended Southwest Missouri State University, where she got a BA in biology. She got her PhD in botany from Vanderbilt. She came to William and Mary, where from 1969 to 2000 was the curator at the herbarium, the beautiful greenhouse on top of the building over on Jamestown Road. She was a professor there for many, many years and taught many students over there. She's been involved in research, searching for flora, her topic today. She has been involved in many publications, as you saw from the list in our newsletter there. One of the co-authors of Atlas of Virginia Flora, just tremendous text on the subject. She's been involved with paintbrush and shovel, a beautiful book that she and Nancy Kober put together. She's one of the directors of the Flora of Virginia project. She was one of the people that after Hurricane Isabel came through, looked at the 2 acres that the Botanical Garden are on and said, you know, this ruined property could be something beautiful. And they started the Botanical Garden, and she's been on the board of directors ever since, and has made that a beautiful island in our community. Her service to all of us just keeps going on, and I just have benefited so much from being in the garden and having her pointing out things and learning from her. And we all can keep learning from her all the time. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Donna to come up and speak to us today. So Donna, thank you.
Ready.
You want your PowerPoint? Okay, we need to share the screen here. Okay, this is where the magic comes in. All right, Dave, are you seeing that?
Yes, yes. Seeing it
Okay.
well, seeing it well.
You're good to go.
Well, thank you so much, Bill and Master Gardeners, for this opportunity to take a look back at some of my botanizing experiences through the years and choose some of my favorite ones to share with you today. But first of all, I'd like to explain my choice of botanical illustrations for this talk. These are botanical watercolors done by a woman named Bessie Marshall, who was a housewife in Petersburg with 9 children, an ailing husband, and a prodigious art talent. And she was employed by the WPA project in the 1930s to illustrate the flora of Lee Park in Petersburg. And so as I talk about other places where I've done botanical projects, when that place shared a component of the flora with Lee Park in Petersburg, I've used her illustration. And I just think she was an exceptional talent and that you would enjoy seeing these renditions of these species. I had three major research interests. The one I'm going to talk about today is termed floristics. But another one has been searching for and monitoring rare plant species in Virginia. The one in particular was the rare orchid, the small coral begonia, pictured on the screen. And then my dissertation topic, although I had initially wanted it to be floristic in nature, turned out to be what's called a revision of a plant genus. It's a taxonomic study. And that genus, Valerianella, you may know as lamb's lettuce or corn salad. And also in Trader Joe's during certain times of the year, it's available packaged under the name mosh. And some people really like adding it to salads. This is a European species that also occurs in our flora that is used in that way. But floristics are held deepest in my heart, I believe, and I chose that for the topic. But one thing I wanted to stress is in biological terms, the difference between floristics and studies of the vegetation. Because often in normal conversation, the terms flora and vegetation get used like synonyms. But to biologists doing studies, they're quite different. And they're done by different people.
Yes.
Pardon?
I think it's somebody at home. Dave, could you mute everybody there at home, please?
Will do.
Thank you.
A taxonomist focuses on identification and classification and naming of species, plus nowadays more and more focused on evolution of species. And I'm sure you're aware of the approaches that ecologists take. In floristics, we focus on, say, the flora of Jamestown Island or the flora of Fluvanna County, or ultimately the flora of Virginia when lots of studies are combined. But an ecologist will say, be visiting a certain sort of forest and taking data so they can describe the appearance of that forest and what the dominant species are. That's where their real interest is, in what is running the show. Whereas the floristics person is interested in everything that's there, weeds and all. And, but with a particular interest in finding rare plants. Most floristic studies are vascular plants, the plants with a system of conduction of water and foodstuffs, xylem and phloem. But I expect you've heard from Helen Hamilton, who's now doing floristics in the mosses. And those are non-vascular plants, as are algae. But the ecologists will be putting things in categories of our trees and their various sizes and shrubs and versus understory plants. And so in the one case, we floristicians estimate abundance. Is it very common, uncommon, or rare? But the person doing a vegetation study will take actual measurements. So we term the one qualitative and the other quantitative. So those are the big differences between a floristic approach and a vegetational approach. And so the kind of studies I'll be talking about are vascular plant studies. They will include the ferns, the gymnosperms, monocots, and dicots, the flowering plants. But others will do subgroups, like some people do just a fern flora. And they can be like the summer flora of such and such place, or to be a complete flora, it must cover all seasons. But the overall goal, or one of the major goals of these studies, is to add information on the distribution of species by, and we usually use counties as our basis, a county-based plant distribution. And preparing to do floristic work, first of all, involves lots of map study. That's absolutely critical. And then I'm showing a list of the kind of information that needs to be taken out in the field each day and carefully linked to a number that is then linked to the vouchered specimen that is collected. And this is totally vital, that these records of distribution have to be backed up by a herbarium specimen, a specimen taken from the field very judiciously. There are ways to be certain that we don't harm populations, and we have to be careful about that. But these specimens are the data that will be deposited in herbaria for others to check our identifications, and then also to be used in all sorts of other studies. So these floristic studies are one of the ways these banks are formed. And by the way, I wondered how many of you have made a field trip to the William and Mary Herbarium? Oh, good. Okay, that might be at least a fourth of the audience here. Great. And for those who haven't, I hope you will. Beth Chambers is the current curator, and she has a lot of fascinating projects underway. So I really encourage you to make that trip. So after taking that information in the field, the plant is taken back to the lab, the plants that are collected on a given day and pressed, and then each one must have a label prepared. Doesn't like my touch. There.
If you touch right there, I'm gonna give
Right where it joins.
you. Yeah, I'm
Okay.
gonna give you that if you touch it with that.
Okay. Mhm. And as you read, this is a label from one of the most recent floristic studies, a student of Martha Case's. And the labels nowadays, not so much in the period of time I did most of my work, but nowadays it's so easy to put lat long designations on the labels too. But they need to show what the habitat was and the location, and notes about things that might be lost in pressing, like flower color, or in this case, he's noted that the narrow leaves are oppressed along the stem. That way later, someone won't think that maybe was caused by the pressing, but will know that those leaves were in that formation to begin with. And so this is a good label is vital. In the old days, a lot of labels would just say, give the town and roadside ditch or whatever. But the goal is actually for a later student to be able to return to that site. And there is a challenge in writing a good label. Okay, so now to my exploits. I'm going to start at the beginning. In high school, I grew up on a small farm in the Ozarks, and the pasture had been allowed to go wild. It was about 10 acres and huge growths of blackberry and gooseberry and we called them hedge trees. Lots of we call them hedge apples too, all over the place. And it was a place you could really get lost in. And I began seeing plants that were just shockingly beautiful and exquisite and complicated looking. And I could just hardly believe that there they were in our cow pasture. So I went to town and had Mother take me to town and bought a Golden Guide to Wildflowers. And that was really my introduction to floristics. The bee balms were the very first plant I identified using my newfound treasure. And these were my first field notes. And number one, bee balms. Let's see, that would be July 12th, 1958. And I recorded about 50 plants up there in the pasture. So it was solely on this basis okay, this is another friend I met up in the pasture that I've had a long-term affection for, and for this watercolor by Bessie Marshall, where you can essentially feel the fuzz. But it was really on this basis that I decided to major in biology in college. And went to Southwest Missouri State in my hometown, lived at home, and majored in biology, and soon got a job as a student assistant in the herbarium there. So my relationship with herbaria goes way back, and took plant taxonomy, and the professor there, Dr. Paul Redfern, was a real mentor to me. And he saw to it that after I graduated, I had an opportunity that summer to do a floristic study at a Campfire Girls camp, not far from Springfield. It was an old spa of the late 1800s with mineral springs and a lot of rock outcrops, a really interesting looking place. I just don't have the touch. Okay, there.
Is that the one you want?
Well, let's see. No, I think it went too far.
Just touch on the edge of the image. Well, it's not working for me. I hate it when it does that. Is
Okay,
that good?
that's good. Mhm. I was a counselor at that Campfire Girls Camp too. And one of my, I actually don't have a whole lot of different memories from that study, but one is of wading along a small stream and looking over on the bank and seeing what to me looked like an exquisite small flowered, purple flowered plant that is this one, which I now know as an incredible weed. in our yard and out on the roadside. But actually up close and personal, its flower heads are intriguing and lacy looking. The elephant's foot. And it's such a pain, particularly because these big leaves hug the ground and shade out practically everything else. But from my vantage point then, it was a very, very riveting plant. Okay, so I was enthralled with the botanical, the botanizing I had had the opportunity to do, and I decided to go to graduate school in that field. And I applied to, I think, 3 schools, and the one I decided on was Vanderbilt, where I was told that, that I would get this National Defense Education Act fellowship, provided this fellow named Stuart Ware got a better one. So that's when I first heard of who was later to become my husband, Stuart Ware. And so it did work out that way. He got one called a NASA traineeship. And so the NDA was available for me. And I was undecided as to a dissertation study. And they really liked for all students to have some sort of extracurricular experience of going to another university or a field station. So that summer after my first year in graduate school, I had a chance to go to Highlands Biological Station and work on the flora of Thompson River Gorge. And it's one of sort of a suite of gorges that cut, of rivers that cut deep gorges along the southern escarpment of the Blue Ridge. And many of these rivers are famous and they have wonderful names like the Chattooga and the Whitewater, the Toxaway, the Horse Pasture, the Eastatoe, and mine was the Thompson. But I took that in stride once I started studying the topographic maps. And there were some fantastic names of the physiographic features like Gallbuster Mountain and others of equally colorful nature. We took 2-week stints down in the gorge, and then would come back to the station to dry the plants, finish drying them. They couldn't dry adequately down there, and do the keying, and then back to the gorge. And it was truly a rugged territory, but I had some terrific help in the form of a man named James White. And he was both the caretaker of the station and the manager of the base camp down in the river gorge. And he was native to the area. And also he could make a Jeep just dance into the most obstructed looking areas. And so he was helped me immeasurably in getting where I needed to go. And he also kept me steeped in rattlesnake stories, and to really keep me adequately alert. But I never did see a rattlesnake on the Thompson, but I certainly heard a lot of rattlesnake stories. So this was a partial flora, a summer flora. But after, I just wanted to put this in as sort of a segue. after this study was finished, I had the opportunity to write a paper from a very colloquial standpoint about my experiences in this river gorge. And after I had gone back to Vanderbilt, finished my work, Stuart had left Vanderbilt and taken the job at William and Mary. And then after I finished, we married and I came to William and Mary. And then several years later, I applied for these grants to go back to the gorge in the spring, again in the summer for further work, and in the fall, so I could publish an entire flora of the Thompson River Gorge. This river was about 10 miles long and maybe perhaps 2 miles wide, and flowed from North Carolina, Transylvania County, North Carolina, into Oconee County, South Carolina. And on one of my last trips there, it was very disturbing because they were creating Lake Jocassee, and it backed up into the lower portions of the gorge. They had cleared the slopes, and it was a nightmare. But in one of the areas that had been only partially cleared and looked like maybe it was going to be safe, on that trip, we saw a beautiful population of the rare Oconee bells, and that was a wonderful treat. This figure of 547 species, that's the total number of species, and 70 was the number that were records. 45 of those were records for those gorges. The other gorges had already been studied or were also in the process of being studied. And so it was difficult to get records there because so much work had already been done in somewhat similar habitats in the other gorges. So I came back to William and Mary from that adventure and took up again what I actually started when I first arrived, and that was to cut my teeth on Virginia flora, which was quite different from where I'd grown up in the Ozarks. And so I chose Charles City County because it was close and hadn't had much previous study. So I made just lots of day trips to Charles City County. And as it turned out, I didn't do my homework well enough. I didn't study geology maps before I made the decision to choose Charles City County. And it turns out that geologically, there have been a lot of gravel overwashes into that county. You may know that there are gravel mines in that county, and they had covered up strata that would have made it a more diverse flora. Actually, had I chosen New Kent County, I would have had added certain habitats that weren't in Charles City County. But nevertheless, I learned a lot from the flora of Charles City County. And it was in the 70s that Mitchell A. Byrd, who was chairman of the department, got a grant from what we call VETCO then, Virginia Power now, to study the flora of the Hog Island, Surrey nuclear power plant. And it was a biota study. I did the flora, Stuart did the vegetation, and Garnet Brooks, the herps, and Mitchell Byrd, the birds. And there were a couple other facets of that study that was all put into a big report to VETCO. It was a mile square study area that's centered on where they plan to build their third and fourth reactors. And for my part of the big study, 502 species, but 375 of them were county records for Surrey County. And that's not a testimony to my visual acuity. It's the fact that it really shows how little work had been done at the point in the 70s when a lot of new plant taxonomists were coming to universities in Virginia. And so it's not just William and Mary where this is happening, it's happening throughout the state. This is one of my very favorite plants, the leopard's bane. Have any of you had the chance to see it in this area? Good, good. I seldom encounter it nowadays, but it's much more frequent a bit further south. In the 80s, the state of Virginia decided to build a new state park, Caledon, on the Potomac. It's near, well, it's King George County on the Potomac, near where 301 crosses the river. And they wanted a floristic study done. And also studies of other biota. The ornithologists had learned there was a fantastic population of summering eagles in the river there. And actually that changed the plans from it becoming a state park then to becoming a state natural area. But now more recently, I think it's been decided that the eagles are secure enough now that they were wanting to really control the visitation to the beach areas. But more recently, it's been determined it could become a state park. And I chose the Arrow Arum in this instance because there were a lot of marsh areas there where it proliferated. And there are 621 species, and about, I believe that's about 44% were records. So there's still a lot of new records being found. It was, let's see, a 2,500 acre parcel. Then later, I had a chance to explore the Grove Creek watershed. And you may not right off the bat know where that is, but it was Grove Creek that was dammed up to form the Rhine River in Busch Gardens. And to have been able to be here before that happened, because so much area was covered that no telling what occurred there. But nevertheless, a wealth of fascinating plants were, so to speak, hiding out in those deep ravines where the soil had been influenced by the dissolved fossil shells. So the soil is very high in calcium. And in many cases, it's not understood whether the plants actually require the high calcium, or it's just that they can stand it and therefore they don't have to compete with other plants that evolved on the uplands in acidic soils that can't tolerate calcium levels like that. But one of the biggest surprises there was really a forest of umbrella magnolia on the slopes above the Rhine River. They could be seen from the Rhine River cruises. And a particularly good find, as we like to say, was Mitella diphylla, the little bishop's cap or mitres wort that is a really, really terrific mountain disjunct. Notice on that map that deep blue, heavy concentration in mountain counties, no blue in the Piedmont. But if you look in the coastal plain and really, really squint, James City County is blue. And York County is supposed to be. Gus Hall also found it at Cheatham Annex in York County. But those are the only two places that, and in fact, when it was first found, it was a record for the coastal plain of the southeastern United States. And so there were a total of 29 species that had this kind of distribution pattern. Not as radical. I've shown you one of the most, the ones I can exclaim about the most, with the huge gap between the mountains and the coastal plain. Many of the others don't have such a big gap, but they're still distinctly disjunct from the major range of the species in the mountains. And the theory is, the hypothesis anyway, is that once these plants range all the way across the state during the time of the glaciers, and then as the glaciers receded, or at some later point when there was a xerothermic period, they died out in between in the Piedmont, but managed to hang on in these deep, humid ravines in the coastal plain where the soils were high in calcium. So, and interestingly, in doing this field work, I was taken back to my background in the Ozarks, which was a limestone-based soil type. And for instance, Campanula americana, the American bellwort, was a plant I had learned in such habitats in the Ozarks. And then there it was in the Grove Creek watershed here in the coastal plain of Virginia. And here are some other examples. I chose some that I thought you may well have used in gardening. The pagoda dogwood is one of the best of the disjuncts too. And as is marsh marigold. Oh, and I should mention the mountain camellia. Now I moved to the 90s when one day I was working in the herbarium and got a call from some women in the Petersburg Garden Club because they had found these scrapbooks from the 30s. And on one page of the scrapbook would be a pressed specimen, and on the facing page, a watercolor. And they wanted me to look at them and see just what I thought. And could they bring these 14 scrapbooks to the herbarium next week? So we set up a meeting, and I had Stuart come down to the lab too, so he could see them at the same time. But my expectations weren't very high. But when I saw them, I was astounded. On the right, you see an example of a herbarium specimen, and the labels done by the WPA workers who were doing this project. And across from it, Bessie Marshall's really botanical illustration. There's no doubt that her work is botanical illustration quality. So we were both just blown away. And so then I had the opportunity to work with the Garden Club in going back to that 1,500-acre area. Well, actually, they were first just interested in about the 300 acres of the park proper to see how many of those species were still there. And then Nancy Colbert wrote the book with paintbrush and shovel. And I was the botanical consultant for the book too. And if you get a magnifying glass, you'll see my name down at the bottom. But it was just a wonderful opportunity. And in fact, and then I decided I expanded it to a floristic study of the watershed in which the park is located. And in fact, I'm still working on that. And this was one of the special plants that I learned in that study, the magnificent Carolina lily. Note how its leaves are broader toward the tip than Lilium superbum's leaves. Okay, now, so this was the work I had been doing, but at the same time, Gus Hall, who was a very charismatic person on the William and Mary faculty to students, and I was not on the teaching faculty. My position was curator of the herbarium and an adjunct professor. So he had many of these master's students doing floristic studies, and I got to be on the committee of most of them. And then J.T. Baldwin had a student, Martha Case has had students since. And this is a list, I think, of 15 floristic studies and where they took place. And so each of those studies recorded, what flora was there at the time as best they could, and added record upon record upon record to our knowledge of the distribution of these various species. There had to be a lot of data points on this for distributions to take shape, whether these species were limited to the coastal plain, were mountain coastal plain disjuncts, just occurred in the Piedmont, or they're just a myriad different distribution patterns that come into view once you have enough data points from studies like these. And there were master's thesis floristic studies done at other universities too, and in Virginia. And also there are these powerhouse botanists like Tom Wiebold at Virginia Tech, and Gary Fleming and others with Heritage, Ted Bradley at George Mason. And a lot of them were doing free roaming floristics as well as some actual floristic studies where they would study maps and figure out where good unusual species might be lurking and would visit them. And so they added their finds, which were many, many, many. And so by the late 1990s, the larder, so to speak, was full enough to really support the digital atlas of the Virginia flora, which replaced the hard copy atlases that preceded it. And also to help underwrite the knowledge that's in those descriptions of each species in the flora, where it tells the habitat and the distribution in general terms, like mountains and Piedmont. And so that information has been added to those entries. So this exploring for the flora was also exploring for Flora was also exploring for the flora and the digital atlas, and now the app has come from all this work. So it's been a real privilege to get to be part of this massive cooperation that has produced the manual of the Flora of Virginia. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Donna? From the audience? Yes.
Are the watercolors that were done by the woman for WK, are they on display anywhere, or are they available to be seen by the general public?
They are periodically. They're owned by the Petersburg Garden Club, and they were at Louis Ginter a while back. And I don't know what the plans are now, but I'll find out. I want to get in touch with them to let them know that I used Bessie Marshall's watercolors in this talk, and I'll check them.
Thanks, Donna.
Is that book available?
It sure is. And I just happen to have a copy. This is it. And there's quite a long text of the history of the project that it is really fascinating. And the African-American women who did all the work.
Did she know that she was recognized in her lifetime?
Not really. It was really a goal of the Petersburg Garden Club to give her her due, even though it was too late for her to know it. And she was really into crafts of many types. She was multi-talented, and to be raising 9 children and tending to a sick husband at the same time.
Are there questions? Yes.
Is the digital atlas, how does one?
Well, just put in your browser, Digital Atlas of Virginia Flora. And now and then when I do it, something else comes up. But be sure that it says Virginia Plant Atlas in the address that comes up. But that works most of the time, and you just have to put in the name of the species, and then its scientific name will pop up, and you hit the name, and then it brings up the map. And these maps are really up to date.
Bill, you might want to ask the people at home.
Yes. Are there questions for Dr. Ware from the people at home? You might have to unmute if you're muted. And Rick, I don't know if you could check the chat for questions.
I think it's mostly people saying good morning.
Okay.
I don't see any questions.
Okay. Very good. Well, Don, we certainly want to thank you again. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.